In the bustling city of Lagos, Nigeria, lived a very wealthy woman named Mrs. Amaka. Mrs. Amaka was known for her elegant style and her large mansion, which was filled with treasures from all over the world. She had a new maid named Chidinma, a young girl from a small village who was very polite and hardworking. Mrs. Amaka was always careful about who she hired, but this time, she decided to test Chidinma to see if she could really trust her. She wanted to know if Chidinma was honest or if she would be tempted by the wealth around her. One day, Mrs. Amaka came up with a plan. She decided to leave her safe open while she went out for a meeting. The safe was where she kept all her most valuable jewelry, including a diamond necklace that was worth millions. Before leaving, she made sure to leave the safe door slightly ajar, with the shiny jewels sparkling inside. Mrs. Amaka also made sure that the security cameras in the house were turned on. She wanted to see what Chidinma would do when she saw the safe open. Would she take something? Or would she leave everything as it was? As Mrs. Amaka left the house, she felt a little nervous. She liked Chidinma and didn't want to find out that she couldn't trust her. But she had to know. Chidinma, who was busy cleaning the living room, noticed that the safe was open. She paused, her heart beating fast. She knew that Mrs. Amaka was very strict about her valuables, and it was strange to see the safe open like this. But instead of going closer, she quickly turned away and continued with her work, pretending she hadn't seen anything. After some time, Chidinma became curious. Why was the safe open? She thought maybe Mrs. Amaka had forgotten to close it before leaving. With cautious steps, she walked closer to the safe, her eyes widening at the sight of the glittering jewels. She stood there for a moment, staring at the beautiful diamonds, gold, and pearls. Then, something strange happened. Chidinma reached out, not to take anything, but to close the safe. She knew it wasn't her place to touch anything inside, but she also didn't want anything to go missing. Just as she was about to close the door, she noticed a small note inside the safe. It had her name written on it. Chidinma picked up the note, her hands trembling slightly. The note read, "If you are honest, you will leave everything as it is." Chidinma felt a wave of relief. She knew this was a test, and she was determined to pass it. Carefully, she placed the note back where she found it, and gently closed the safe door. She quickly returned to her cleaning, trying to forget about what had just happened. A few hours later, Mrs. Amaka returned home. She went straight to her office, where she could check the security camera footage. As she watched the video, she saw everything that had happened. She saw Chidinma's hesitation, her curiosity, and finally, her decision to close the safe without taking anything. Mrs. Amaka smiled, feeling proud of Chidinma. But just as she was about to turn off the video, something unexpected caught her eye. Mrs. Amaka leaned in closer to the screen, her eyes narrowing. She replayed the last few seconds of the footage. There was something she hadn't noticed before. Just after Chidinma closed the safe, she seemed to look around nervously. Then, in a swift motion, she reached under the rug in the corner of the room and pulled out a small envelope. Mrs. Amaka's heart skipped a beat. What could that be? She wondered. She watched as Chidinma carefully opened the envelope, revealing a piece of paper. Chidinma read the paper quickly, her face growing pale, and then she slipped the envelope back under the rug and hurried out of the room. This unexpected action puzzled Mrs. Amaka. What was written on that paper? And why had Chidinma hidden it so carefully? Mrs. Amaka knew she had to find out. The next morning, after Chidinma had left for the market, Mrs. Amaka went to the room where the safe was kept. She lifted the rug and found the envelope just as she had seen in the video. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, she found a note written in messy handwriting. It read, "Do as I say, or I will tell your madam what I know. Meet me tonight at the old warehouse." Mrs. Amaka's mind raced. Who could have written this note? And what could they know that would scare Chidinma so much? Was Chidinma in some kind of trouble? Determined to get to the bottom of this, Mrs. Amaka decided to follow Chidinma that night. She dressed in plain clothes so she wouldn't be recognized and left the house just after sunset. As she reached the old warehouse, she saw Chidinma standing outside, looking around nervously. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness and approached Chidinma. Mrs. Amaka could barely make out their conversation, but she saw the fear in Chidinma's eyes. The figure handed Chidinma another note and whispered something to her before disappearing into the night. Mrs. Amaka waited until Chidinma left before she quietly followed her back to the house. Her heart was heavy with worry. She needed to confront Chidinma, but she also wanted to protect her from whatever was going on. The next morning, Mrs. Amaka called Chidinma into her office. She handed her the note she had found under the rug and watched as Chidinma's face turned white with fear. "Who is threatening you, Chidinma?" Mrs. Amaka asked gently. "You don't have to be afraid. You can tell me everything." Chidinma hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't want you to know, madam," she whispered. "But I don't know what to do. They said they would hurt my family if I didn't do what they asked." Mrs. Amaka's heart softened as she listened to Chidinma's story. She knew now that the girl wasn't a thief but was caught in a dangerous situation. She decided then and there to help her, no matter what it took. "We will face this together," Mrs. Amaka said firmly. "You are not alone." But just as they began to plan, a loud knock echoed through the house. Mrs. Amaka and Chidinma exchanged worried glances. Could it be the mysterious person from the warehouse? The loud knock sent chills down Chidinma's spine. Mrs. Amaka's heart pounded as she slowly approached the door, motioning for Chidinma to stay back. She took a deep breath and opened the door, only to find a delivery man standing there, holding a small package. Mrs. Amaka sighed in relief and took the package, but as soon as she closed the door, she noticed something strange. There was no label on the package, no sender information, just a plain brown box. Who could have sent this? Mrs. Amaka wondered aloud. Chidinma, still shaken, watched from the corner of the room as Mrs. Amaka carefully opened the package. Inside, there was a small black device, a phone, along with a note. The note read, "You thought you could outsmart me? Watch your back. This is just the beginning." Mrs. Amaka's hands trembled as she realized the gravity of the situation. Whoever was behind this knew everything. They were being watched, and this was a warning. She quickly turned the phone over and saw that it was already on. The screen displayed a countdown timer, ticking down from 24 hours. "What do they want from us?" Chidinma whispered, her voice filled with fear. Mrs. Amaka didn't have an answer, but she knew they had to act fast. "We need to leave the house," she said firmly. "We don't know what's going to happen when that timer runs out." They quickly packed a few essentials and were about to head out when the phone suddenly rang. The caller ID displayed only one word: unknown. Mrs. Amaka hesitated, then answered the call. A distorted voice on the other end spoke. "You can run, but you can't hide. The game has just begun." Before Mrs. Amaka could respond, the line went dead. The ticking timer continued, each second bringing them closer to an unknown danger. With no time to waste, Mrs. Amaka and Chidinma rushed out of the house, not knowing where to go or who to trust. As they drove through the dark streets of Lagos, their minds raced with questions. Who was behind this? What did they want? And most importantly, how far were they willing to go? The car's headlights cut through the night, but every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Mrs. Amaka's grip on the steering wheel tightened as she glanced at Chidinma, who was holding the phone with the ticking timer in her lap. Just as they reached the outskirts of the city, the phone buzzed with a new message. Chidinma nervously opened it. The message read, "You're heading the wrong way. Turn back or face the consequences." Mrs. Amaka's breath caught in her throat as she realized the terrifying truth: they were being tracked. Someone knew exactly where they were, and they weren't going to let them escape. With no other options, Mrs. Amaka made a sharp U-turn and started driving back toward the city. The timer on the phone continued to tick down, the seconds slipping away faster than ever. They didn't know what awaited them when the timer reached zero, But one thing was clear. They were caught in a dangerous game, and the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. As they sped back into the heart of Lagos, a thick fog began to roll in, making it hard to see the road ahead. Mrs. Amaka's heart raced, knowing that with every mile they drove, they were getting closer to whoever or whatever was behind this nightmare. And then, through the mist, they sight a large, dark figure standing in the middle of the road, blocking their path. Mrs. Amaka slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. The timer on the phone hit the 1-minute mark, ticking louder and louder. As the figure slowly approached the car, Chidinma whispered in terror, "What do we do now?" But before Mrs. Amaka could answer, the car's headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. The last thing they heard was the final beep of the timer as it hit 0.